This is Polarized Light Microscopy in Archaeology, and this is the lecture on the Yemen and the pottery of the medieval period that I looked at there. And the Yemen is in southern Arabia, about here. And here's the campaign map, and you can see that there's a number of sites around here that were studied as part of a ROM project, particularly in the 80s and 90s. Oh, and there's another arrow. Here is the Google Earth version of that. And in this you can see why this group is isolated from everywhere else, because it's mostly desert in between. Around here there is rainfall. You can see a touch of green in the Yemen, like on the other side. Monsoon, typically. And so there's quite a high population in southwest Arabia, and it's quite a distinctive culture there, which of course is a part of the general culture of the Middle East, but also slightly distinct. It's isolated to a certain extent, but also very well connected by the sea. And like that. Oh, and there's another arrow. Isn't that nice? So here's a close-up of the field area. I'm here at this is the current capital of Sunahara. Aden was also a capital when it was divided into two. Taiz was also a capital at times in the past, and another capital was Zabid, was a major city in the medieval period. And this was the center of field work in the 80s, just driving around in a truck looking for pottery, because it's not the jungle. There's no trees in the way. It's just land. And so in that work, archaeological sites were found sitting on the surface and were recorded, and the pottery was picked up from them. This is what the landscape looks. This is actually within the Wadi Basin, where the water was retained and used for growing things, but it shows you the quite flat topography of this area known as the Tahama, and behind it the highlands, the mountains from the opening of the Red Sea. This is like called Galaifica on the coast, and it doesn't look like much like an archaeological site. Here you can see there's an offshore bar that creates quite a nice harbor. There was a number of these along the Red Sea coast, and this bar created by longshore drift would often migrate up the coast. And in one place at least, we found a number of sites following the movement of what would have been the port. Galaifica was very important in the 12th century, and we found a lot of imported pottery there. But it shows you what these archaeological sites were like. There's a lot of wind coming in from the sea, and so they're typically deflated. There is some archaeology underneath, in some cases quite a lot, but the actual archaeological site itself is quite easily seen even when you're driving by on the road or on trackways, and you're looking on the horizon for a redder area of the ground, and this will be pottery scatters, because all the wind has blown away all the soil and left this is called deflation. And this leaves what is known as a pavement. Quite often in natural conditions, these may be rocks, but in this case it's pottery. And so it's a pavement of pottery. So being an important area, and yet also somewhat isolated, it had its own distinctive pottery styles. And little was known, or actually next to nothing, was known about the chronology of the pottery or the technology of the pottery or where the pottery was from. Some of it clearly was imported from elsewhere in the Middle East and also from China and Europe. The European stuff would be like 19th century and later. But most of it looked like it was probably locally made. And of course, this is mostly what you see here is unglazed pottery. Although you can get glazed pottery and the sand abrades it away and all you have left is unglazed pottery. The center of the field area was the city of Zabid. And here you can see the Google Earth image of it. And here we undertook excavations. This is the citadel of the city. And here you can see trenches made into the ground underneath. There's actually quite a lot of archaeology underneath here. Here you can see another site on really beyond the periphery of what was then Zabid in about 1988. But it shows that the city was actually much bigger in those days, and this would have been a robbed out wall, and there are lavatories on a number of horizons, different levels, up against this wall, which was used through successive periods. This is a very old photograph, as you can see, is another area near the citadel, and you can see it again, very deep stratigraphy. So underneath some of those scatters may be deep stratigraphy, but it was mostly not excavated. And of course, one of the excavators was me. This is me in 1988 or 1989. It was like January to December, a long time ago. So the pottery, this is actually a photograph taken quite a long time ago when we thought green velvet was a nice idea, and we were so poor at the museum I had to make my own scales. And this has some things which are obviously imports, like these luster wares, and these incised wares, blue painted wares, and other incised wares. And these turquoise glazed wares, these actually are not imports, were actually locally made. There were a number of attempts to photograph. These are the imports, and they would often include local wares until all this had been completely worked out. But most of these are actually imports. And one of the objectives in the research was working out where the imports came from, which were actually imports and weren't locally made, and what could we find out about the local industry. So since we've already talked about the products of Basra, which is what these all are, and this is either going to be Basra or very close by it, other Iraqi production centers, and also Iranian production centers. But what this is about is the local pottery. So we found in the driving around 2 areas where there was evidence of pottery manufacture. One of these was Zabid itself, where an area northeast of the city, downwind of the city, of course, was covered with wasters. And so wasters are pieces of pottery which have been ruined in the firing and would have been discarded, and there would be no further away from the kiln than you could throw it. And it probably happened often enough that you wouldn't go, oh, damn this pottery, this is a waster, and throw it with any vigor. It would just be like tossed aside. I'm trying to show you that with my hand at the moment. You can't see me at the same time, so just tossed aside. And at the site of Haiz down here, where other kiln evidence was found of kiln furniture. This is the kind of kiln furniture that was found at Haiz. This is actually probably either a base of a kiln or some other kiln furniture inserted into the kiln, because it has, because it's quite heavy pottery, it has no other purpose, ceramic, and it has bits of these small glazed bowls which had been glazed, And here you can see trivets. And so these trivets are put inside bowls when they're fired. And this is a problem with glazed pottery, because if you want to stack the pottery, and of course with unglazed pottery, just stack it up and fire it, and it's all well and good. But when the pottery is glazed, the glaze will run, it will flow from one vessel to the other, and when it cools, it'll all be stuck together. A lot of wasters that are found are like several vessels glued together by, not glued together, just fused together by the previously molten glaze after it cools. And so trivets like these would be put inside a bowl, and then another bowl will be put on top. You can just see on here the traces of bases. And so that's evidence for production. Another evidence for production is that they still made pottery there. And this is an immense pit where they would collect the clay. So this pit is actually in the Wadi Basin. In the background you can see the mountains behind. And remember these mountains behind because we'll get to it in a minute. But down in the Wadi Basin was one of the sources of clays. I gave it away then. I said one of the sources of clays, didn't I? Because at Heights there were two types of clay. And this is actually a thin section through a scar of pottery that was on one of the trivets. See, this is the trivet, and this is a red clay body. And this is what would have come out of the wadi. And this, however, is a white clay. This is a kaolinitic clay. I did chemical analysis of it later, so it's a white kaolinitic clay with no more than should be normally found in kaolinitic clay, which is like very decomposed feldspars and a lot of quartz. And so at this site, clearly there are two sources, and part of the reason I went out to Zabid one year, or Heights, around there, was to look for the sources of clay, and also to excavate. Of course, in Zabid, where we found the wasters, we were able to excavate and found the kiln underneath. So a lot of this was actually published before we excavated, just to show what we knew could be defined as being imported and what was local, but this shows what was underneath the wasters. And I don't seem to have a photograph of the wasters, but I do have some photographs of some other wasters in a minute. So this is what we found in the red fabric, is basically a lot of basalt and minerals derived from basalt. And really little else. So this defined the red clay fabric that we found in those trivets, and of course we found quite a lot of pottery like that. Here is one of them with a white slip on it. Here's the glaze, and here you can see some of the minerals derived from the basalt. This is a nice big clinopyroxene. This is kind of cute. It actually has a bit of red clay as a nodule inside a white clay body. So here's the white clay. You can see there's fragments of quartz and heavily corroded feldspars somewhere. Usually they're so badly corroded that they're difficult to distinguish from the clay, because the clay, after all, is decayed feldspar. Kaolin is formed in a process called kaolinization, in which feldspar turns into kaolin. And so you'll have some of the feldspars are still slightly preserved, but not a lot, and they're very difficult to identify. Here's another bit of the white fabric with quartz and possibly some feldspars, and the occasional bit of opaque. And this is the Zabid petrofabric. And there, again, will be some basalt. It's hard to get away from basalt on the Tahama. because the mountains are mostly made of basalt. They're from the opening of the Red Sea and large flows of basalt that opened when the Red Sea opened. But also there were intrusive rocks, and among these are these very unusual feldspars with quartz inclusions inside them. This is known as granophyre. That's Granophyre. Guess I could have written it down, but it's a bit late now. And here is another granophyre. And here you can see the intergrowth of somewhat decayed feldspar and quartz. And here is a finer grained texture. And so here's a geological map of the area. And I actually went exploring up around here and up around here to look at this. The geology map itself is from a map. So I was able to examine some of these and found the map isn't strictly right in some cases, but it's still indicative of what's going on. And so here's Highs down here, and so you can see it's situated down on the wadi bed where it drains the basalts up here, the tertiary basalt. It was from the tertiary period that the Red Sea opened. It's actually not that long ago, like 60 million years ago or so. And so that is drained down to here. But as you can see also, there's what is known as tertiary granite. And these granites are of about the same date. These would have intruded into the local landscape, now completely denuded away, of course, because this was lifted way up when the Red Sea divided, and so has been eroded away since then. And you get these granophyric feldspars quite often in this sort of environment associated with the opening of the Red Sea. I've seen the same in Oaxaca in Mexico, and I've seen published examples from Scotland from the opening of the Atlantic. So it seems to be often associated with this opening of seas sort of phenomenon. And of course here's Zabid. So this is where the granophyre comes from, but it's also where the kaolin clay comes from. Now the thing about this is, for some reason, none of this gets into the pottery made in Highs here. However, it's a short walk over here to possibly, and almost certainly, I never did find it, but our deposits of kaolin clay, actually at the foot of these granitic mountains. So therefore Highs would have this access to these two different resources down in the alluvial deposits and also the primary clay deposits up here, whereas Zabid is just getting the stuff worn down and eroded out and brought down by the seasonal wadis, and this would include the granophyre. Interestingly enough, we found another kiln site up here which doesn't include it. So just shows you. This is the site of Faza. Let me go back. Here's Al-Faza. At Faza, I was telling you that there was the site where we actually found a number of sites. And you can see here there's this embayment from longshore drift. And this is the most recent one. And next to it, because this would be a nice place for ships to harbor, is basically the port of Zabid. And so pottery, they would probably have temporary buildings here possibly, or mud brick that's all washed away or something. But as the bay moved along the coast over the centuries, the archaeological sites moved with it. And so there's a Fasa A and a Fasa B and a Fasa C. And one time I was walking along the beach here, and I noticed the interior was covered with clay. It's not sandy here, it seems to have a lot of clay in it, because these are deposits, overbank deposits from the wadis, and it's very fine clay with nothing in it. And so I thought, it's probably very fat clay, with not too many aplastics in it. But of course, I'm also standing on the beach at the time, and I'm thinking, well, this would make a very nice temper. So if you took the clay, it added the temper to it, you would have the sand to it, the beach sand to it, you'd have quite nice pottery. And I looked at some of the pottery of the 9th century, the same time they were making pottery in Zabid, and I found that it was filled with large rounded grains of sand, which is not like the finer angular sand that you would get at Zabid and the other sites. And so I took it back and thin sectioned it and found it was a very interesting, even greater diversity of inclusions because of the longshore drift had brought sand up along the beach for miles down the coast. So it was really quite distinct from the other sites. These are the wasters. This is typical 9th century pottery. No, these aren't wasters. This is just pottery. But unfortunately, I don't seem to have a nice photograph of them, and we don't have the new microscope working yet, although we've had it for months. So this is the other site I mentioned, Al Fashal, and here you can see it's covered with wasters. And so this was found in a later season. What went there in this village, there was this big mound of ash, and so in it were all these wasters, and so there was clearly a lot of pottery being made here. All of this is about the 12th century or so. Some of it would have been glazed, but it's so badly fired that you can't really identify it. And this is the Al Fashal petrofabric, and it's rather like Zabid, but there's no granophyre in here. So it's quite odd. Why? I assume because there's granophyre upstream from Zabid, but not upstream from Al Fashal. And obviously the petrofabric deities have decided it should be so. Right, so the pottery, therefore, I mean, the earlier pottery, that unglazed stuff from the 9th century, we only found was made in Zabid and also at Fasa on the coast. But later they started making glazed pottery. This is a type known as stars and stripes ware, because it has stars and stripes in it, and it's rather too complicated technically to go into. And from looking at the forms, this is quite closely related to Fatimid lusterwares from Egypt of the 11th century and the early 12th century. And so it's probably of about that date. So this would be the earliest glazed wares that they had in Yemen. This is a type known as salad ware. This was named by Ed Keel, who directed the project, and being English, his idea of a salad is an English salad, which has typically, English salads are disgusting things with very wilted dark green lettuce. You can see it's not nice crisp lettuce like we get in Canada. It's very wilted and sort of disgustingly green. And on it is mayonnaise, but no, it's not mayonnaise. It's what they call in England salad cream, because salad cream is not mayonnaise. It's kind of like mayonnaise, but it's mostly filled with coagulants and colorants. And so it's a very peculiar yellow color. So for the English, this is what a salad looks like. This rather disgusting green color with this disgusting yellow color on it. And I find it quite attractive as pottery, but you can imagine why I would never eat salad in England ever again. So saladware, actually, though it's highly decorated, the forms are related to yuan imports of the 14th century. They're also making direct copies of yuan pottery, and so that would date that sort of thing. And here's a close-up, complete with dust. And there's also this turquoise slip painted ware, which was, oh, I forgot to tell you. So this stuff is actually made in Hais. So this is made in Zabid. So this is made in both places. This is got a red clay body and has a white slip on it. Sometimes it's a clay, sometimes it's not a clay, it's crushed quartz. The chronology of this is actually trying to, in a way, emulate blue and white pottery, ultimately from China, although probably what they were copying were imports from Iran that was copying pottery from China, or influenced by pottery from China. As you can see, it's very far away in appearance and motifs, but ultimately that's what it's related to. And here you can see a thin section. Here is one of the stone paste slips with an alkali glazed over it. This is an early example of the technology. The form of this would actually suggest that this is 12th century, not 14th and 15th century. And here are some of the later ones, more related to blue and white in a way. And there is also actual blue and white. Here you can see this is very closely related to the wave and rock motif you would find on yuan pottery. So it's possible that, again, instead of seeing yuan pottery, although we did find yuan pottery in Yemen, there's also a lot of pottery made in Iran found around this part of the world, like the Indian Ocean ware, as we called it in the Timurid study. And so they're quite often copying the Iranian products rather than copying the Chinese products. It's the Iranian products which are copying the Chinese products. So the blue and white is quite interesting in that there are two variants of it. There's one with a red clay body and a white clay slip, making the white pottery, which is then painted with cobalt blue. Here's the glaze. And this is an example of it. So you can see it's a red clay body, and it has a white slip underneath the glaze here. And here's the slip without the glaze. So, oh, and here's a white one. So this has a completely white body. So this is actually quite interesting because since we had evidence of production in Hais and in Zabid, and before I actually thin-sectioned it, it was hypothesized that maybe the white stuff came from Hais and the red-bodied stuff came from Zabid, but it didn't. It all came from Hais. So both the white-bodied, and it's another white-bodied one, and the red-bodied all seem to be made in Hais, and so it may have just been that some potters had access to the white clay and other potters did not. And typically potters will be quite proprietorial about their sources of clay and own the land. It's not what happens is not that you have a potter just merrily skipping off into the countryside to look for a bucket of clay and coming back to make pottery. They need to rely on the raw materials, and they will dig. I mean, when it's a major production center like these were locally, you need a lot of clay, and so you need to be able to rely on that clay and go back to it time and time again. And so they would own that land. It would be land they owned, or they couldn't rely on it, and you could not have basically an industry. And that's why there's that big pit. And so later on in Heis, they were making the cups. So these are the things that were on those trivets, the little green lead glazed with copper in them, making these little cups. And these are actually coffee cups, because if you know anything about the origins of coffee, you'll know that it is actually from that part of the world, from Ethiopia and the Yemen. It was spread after the Ottomans conquered it in the 16th century. And so the Ottomans conquered Yemen, and coffee drinking became a big thing. And they spread that around into Europe. And we've been relying on it ever since. Here's some very nice early, probably 16th century ones, and they carried on making them up until recent times. Judging by the appearance of this is quite a recent one, and this is the quality of pottery that they're actually still making in Heis until recent times. So that's the Zabid study. It's the first major study I did on pottery, and was quite important at the time as a model of comparing imported and locally made pottery and working out which was which, and was quite good. But unfortunately, the photographs are kind of old. I should take some new ones sometime. So, thank you.